in today's cosplay video, I'm going to show you how I made my Zelda costume from Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. For Zelda's dress, I'm using a pattern from Indigo Patterns, and this is a digital print-at-home pattern. So you start by printing out the first page, making sure the box is to scale, then print all the pages, tape them together, and cut them out. Here are the two main fabrics I'm using for this dress. The first is a green rayon blend, and the second is a linen look fabric that's an off-white color. I wanted something with a lot of texture that would give it that kind of historical look. Before we start sewing, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the construction of this dress, since it's a bit different than the dresses you would normally see. Starting off with, it has a separating zipper in the front, and that's how you get in and out of this dress. Second is that this dress is basically a boned bodice, and then everything is built on top of that. So we're going to start by making the inner layer, and then everything's really mostly just either machine or hand sewn to that piece. I cut the lining pieces out of the rayon fabric, but since it's a bit on the drapier side, it wasn't going to be strong enough for adding the boning channels. So I flat-lined the lining pieces with some cotton sateen. Now you may notice that there are two different colors, and that's because I didn't have enough of the green, but since it's going to be hidden anyways, it shouldn't be a problem. Sew the lining pieces together along the side seams, leaving the center front open. Sew a separating zipper into the front of the bodice so that it's facing away from the body. I pressed the seam allowances flat and then sewed them into place to create boning channels. This dress is really going to need boning since it is strapless and is not going to stay up on me otherwise. I cut the front pieces out of just the rayon. I didn't add any of the sateen for extra thickness because I want them to be a little bit drapey. I laid out all of the outer bodice pieces on the floor so I could keep track of which piece goes where. Then I sewed them together and sew the top and bottom pieces together. Sew some loose gathering stitches along the top of the bodice. Since it's going to be a very light gather, I only did one row instead of 2 rows of stitches. Putting right sides together, sew the outer portion of the bodice to the lining along the top, making sure to fold both of the ends inward. Edge stitch the seam allowance towards the lining, then trim away the excess. Insert some plastic boning into the channels that we made earlier. I cut the skirt piece out of the green fabric and sewed a rolled hem along the bottom edge. Pleat the skirt, following the markings on the pattern. Sew the skirt piece to the lining. Fold the outer part of the bodice back over and then hand sew it into place. I cut the outer dress pieces out of a off-white linen-like fabric. Then for the longer dress pieces, I went ahead and serged the edges to help keep them from fraying on the sides without the pleats. Sew the outer dress pieces together along the side seams. Finish off the bottom edge using a rolled hem. The instructions then say to pleat the sides. I'm not sure if I did mine perfectly, but we're just going to roll with it. And then we're going to iron the pleats into place, and I also hand stitched them. Since my fabric is really soft, they'll just fall right back out. So the hand stitching will help keep them in place. I sewed the facing pieces together and also serged along the bottom edge to help keep it from fraying. Putting right sides together, sew the facing to the top of the outer dress. Serge away the excess seam allowance. Press the seam allowances downwards towards the base dress, then serge along the remaining raw edges on the sides. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the facing to the dress along the side seams. Turn the facing right side out and press it flat. Now I'm going to go through and hand tack the facing to the seam allowance of the underdress so that it doesn't move upwards while I'm wearing it. Hand sew the outer dress to the base dress along both sides of the zipper. You don't have to worry about the stitches being perfect because this will be covered up by the tabard later. And with that, we have the finished base dress. Don't worry about how exposed it is in the front here because that's going to be covered up by the underskirt later. For the skirt, I'm using the same green fabric as the dress, as well as the pattern from Indigo Pattern. One modification I made to the pattern was trimming off the bottom edge of the seam allowance of both of the skirt pieces. This is because I'm going to be cutting them with the edge being on the selvage so that it'll have the look of being frayed without hopefully fraying. Sew the darts following the markings on the pattern pieces, Then I went ahead and serged along the edges to help keep them from fraying. Sew the skirt back pieces together and insert a zipper. Putting right sides together, we're going to sew the skirt pieces together along the side seams. Since the rayon fabric is really drapey, I didn't think it was going to be sturdy enough for the waistband, so instead I cut it out of some scrap green sateen and applied some fusible interfacing. Fold the waistband in half and sew it together along each of the sides, and we're not sewing all the way down to the bottom, we're just sewing this part. Turn the waistband right side out and press it flat. Putting right sides together, sew one side of the waistband to the top of the skirt. Fold over the waistband, tucking the raw edges inward, then sew into place all along the bottom edge. And lastly, I sewed on a skirt hook to finish off the skirt. And now we have a finished skirt. For Zelda's tabard, I'm using this green linen. It's actually a lot brighter green in person than it's showing up on camera, but it was something that I already had in my stash and I didn't really want to spend any more money on this project. Cut two of the tabard pieces out of the green fabric and on one of them apply some fusible interfacing. I used a pencil to trace the tabard design onto some heat and bond. I then ironed the heat and bond onto some scrap fabric. Fun fact, this gold-colored linen is from my Malon cosplay. Cut out the designs, then peel off the paper backing. Iron the designs onto the tabard. I also went ahead and top-stitched along the edges just to keep them anchored in place. Putting right sides together, sew the tabard to the tabard lining all around the edge, leaving a space open at the top so it can be turned right side out. Turn the tabard right side out and press it flat. Then we're going to hand sew the hole closed. Please excuse my messy sewing area, but this is a try-on of Zelda so far. Pretty happy with how it fits and everything. The only thing is, as you can kind of see, there's like this big gap at the bust, and I'm worried it's gonna only get worse once I add all of the beads and everything to the tabard and just pull it away from me. So after I finish the tabard and add the snaps to attach it, probably what I'm gonna have to do is to add some darts at the bust just to keep it from like falling away from me. Also, spoilers, I did end up sewing those darts into one on each side. For Zelda's accessories, I'm using the kit from Illustrious Models, and it looks like it has arrived here nice and safely all the way from Australia. So I laid out all of the pieces with the tabard, and I kind of underestimated how much there was on this. Technically, in the game, these are beads that are on strings that are hanging in front of her tabard, but just for ease, I may end up sewing them directly to the fabric. I painted the pieces and then sewed them onto the tabard. One thing to keep in mind if you do end up purchasing this kit is that you may have noticed that some of them didn't have the holes in them that they needed, and while that worked out for me sewing it on because I could just loop the thread over it, it may be an issue if you are trying to do the cord method. I then hand sewed the tassel beads onto the bottom of the tabard. Now, a couple notes about this. First, she's supposed to have a silver bar here. I totally forgot about that, and I don't feel like putting it on. There's not enough room for me to do that, so not worrying about it. Also, in the reveal photos, you'll notice that I only have one layer of the beads on. That's because one of the pieces slid underneath my desk and I couldn't find it before the photo shoot, so I didn't have them all sewn on. And lastly, one of the pieces arrived cracked, so I can't add those two pieces together. I might maybe like take a thread and then glue these two together if I do another photo shoot in this costume, but for now I'm just leaving it as is. So now that we have all the details added to the tabard, it's time to attach it to the dress. And to do that, I sewed on 4 snaps, and you can see the corresponding pieces on the dress. We've got one inside and one outside. And you'll notice that I sewed them on slightly differently. This is because in general, if you're sewing anything that has a protrusion on, you want that to go away from the body. So that's why on the inside, I have the pieces with the indent in it and the pieces with the protrusion are on the outside. Now the finished tabard can simply snap into place. You may have noticed that we've been missing one part of the dress, and that is the beads that go along the chest. And for those, I used the same shell beads that I used for the jewelry, strung it onto a wire because these are really heavy. So the wire is stronger than using thread, and I sewed the wire to the dress underneath the tabard My chest circumference and that area is a bit narrower than the dress form, so it won't fit on the dress form with that on. Also, I'm filming this after the photo shoot, and I took this piece off so that I could wash the dress since it was really hot the day that I was doing the photo shoot. And to have the finished look, I guess I would sew it back on, but I didn't want to do that for this video because I don't know when I'm going to be wearing it again. I have a friend who wants to do a photo shoot together, so I'm not ready to part with this dress yet, but also I don't know when that's going to be, and I don't know what size I'm going to be when that time comes. So I'm just going to leave this unattached for now, and when it's time to wear it again, I'll sew it back on. Also, I forgot to mention that as you can see, it likes to fall down a lot, so I do have to add some tacking stitches to keep it in place. The main beads I'm going to be using for Zelda's accessories are these clear quartz beads and then these shell beads. Both of them I got from Joann's, and beads can get really expensive really fast, so I purchased these over the course of a couple months using coupons. And the reason I went for the shell beads is because they were a lot cheaper than having fully stone beads for the entire costume. These were perhaps the easiest part of the costume to make, and we have her 2 upper armbands, her 2 bracelets, and her anklet, and these had 2 holes in each of the beads, so I just used 2 strings of clear elastic on them. And then for her bracelets, there's only 1 hole through the quartz, and I just alternated a shell bead and a quartz bead over and over again until it went all the way around the wrist. Moving on to her earrings, I kind of struggled a bit with these, and you can kind of tell. So first off, the paint didn't go on the way I hoped it would. My masking was with just Scotch tape instead of real painter's tape, and I definitely should have done painter's tape because as you can see, it's not very clean lines here. I tried to go over it a little bit with some acrylic, but it was still such a contrast between the brown and the white that they still showed through, but thankfully it's not super noticeable in photos. So the base earring and these little dangly bits are part of the kit from Illustrious Models, and they have these holes in the top and the bottom for attaching them together. However, I didn't have any jump rings that would really fit through the holes, and also because there's a bit of a curve to them, I couldn't get a needle through, so what I did was just take some thread and by hand looped it through and tied it into a knot on the bottom, and then on the top I took some wire and just looped it through and then twisted the ends so that it hopefully won't come undone. And since I don't have pierced ears, I just used some clip-on earring backs. For her necklace, I switched it up a little bit. So the base of the necklace is still elastic, and threaded that through with a pattern of 3 shell beads, 1 quartz, 3 beads, 1 quartz. And then on the ends, I tied on some jump rings and some chain as well as a clasp. And that's because even with the elastic, her necklace is rather high up on her neck, and I wouldn't be able to have enough stretch to have it sit the way I wanted it to be. So this way it'll be nice and adjustable. Now this pendant was part of the Illustrious Model kit, and I wanted it to be removable. However, the way the hole in the top is, I couldn't just have a little clasp to attach it. So instead, I took some beads that were in my stash, used the trusty thread, tied it to the necklace, and then when the time came to pose with it during the photo shoot, I just cut it off. By now you've probably guessed how I put her tiara together, and yep, I just tied it using some thread and then added some thread loops at the end so that I can pin it to my wig. Speaking of wigs, the wig I'm using is from Wig Supplier, and this is pretty much what it looked like out of the bag. I just pinned the bangs back, and the braid, it's glued on and it's not really staying, so I just used bobby pins to pin it closer to the head so that it would stay in place, and then use the rest of the hair from the back to just kind of cover that end there. It had these little pieces that were just kind of going off into the distance, so I trimmed those down a little bit as well. And in case you were wondering about my ears, they are latex elf ears that are from Aradani Studios, and they just go on with a little bit of spirit gum. And lastly, we have the sword. This is not the best. It's not even sanded, but I pretty much just crunched this out in 4 days because my first attempt at the sword didn't work. The file that I used for that one, the pieces didn't fit together. So I bought a second pattern, and that's the one that I ended up using for this sword. And also, as you can kind of see here, it was so hot and humid that the two-part epoxy I used to glue the pieces together didn't set at this point. For some reason, it glued everything else together, but at this point, it just refused to cure even after, I think it was somewhere between 12 and 24 hours, and it just wasn't sticking. So I hot glued it. You can see that there. I tried to intentionally have the hot glue kind of mush in with all of the details here so that it hopefully wouldn't be too noticeable in pictures, since it was just going to be a prop for just a couple shots. And then again, since I was on a time crunch, I spray painted the purple and the blue and then just did a quick gradient with some brown. And for the gold and green, those were just acrylic paint. And now for the reveal. Overall, I'm really happy with how this costume turned out. There are a couple things that I would fix if I was to wear this again, such as the paint chips and other little things that I mentioned throughout the video. But the costume itself, I love the photos that Brittany took of this costume. You can't tell that it was super hot the day that we were doing the photo shoot and I was sweating so much, but thankfully this is a really comfortable costume. The wig is rather short, I'm in sandals, the material is quite breathable, so it is a costume that I could wear all day at a convention, and it's definitely something that I would wear again if my friend wants to do the photo shoot for it. So overall, super happy with this costume, and I hope you enjoyed the video of making it. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.